Good morning, Emily.
Hi, Dan.
You look cold.
I am always cold at the office.
What are we talking about today?
Finding a professional niche, what happens when one partner is overspending, and how to deal with it when folks ask for your advice but never take it.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, finding a professional niche, what to do when your partner's overspending, and what to do when people aren't taking your advice. This is super easy. Do what you went to college for. Take away their credit card and slap them until they listen to you.
That's not necessarily what we're able to do, but they're not bad ideas.
I can try. I can give it the old college try. We could make this a super short podcast.
That's true. But what fun would that be?
That's fair. I do love the sound of my own voice. So hit me. What am I gonna talk to you about?
All right. Well, the first point is, I'll start with the advertising yourself piece, because that's something I've found myself having to do more and more of now that I'm licensed and I am a planner. A lot of people ask kind of short little questions like, oh, well, what is that? Or what does that mean? Or what do you do? And what we actually do is kind of a whole long list and in-depth conversation if you're going to get into it. But of course, you can't jump into that, nor do people usually actually care that much. You need more of like an elevator pitch. And it's hard to explain what we do to people.
So it's a funny thing here, and I want to pull back a little bit because how you framed your initial topic is slightly different than what you're now asking me. So I'm going to just take a little bit of a step back. So at face value, you sort of have a hierarchy of just who you are, what you do, right? Somebody meets you, they say, "What do you do?" You say, "I'm a financial planner." They go, "Cool," and they walk away and try to go find a drink somewhere. There's this sort of immediate non-branded, non-personalized perception because you have the same response when you hear about other people's profession, right? Somebody says, "I'm a doctor," and oh, what kind of doctor are you? Neat. Like, what do you do as a doctor? What is, do you see patients? Are you like a researcher? Neat. Somebody says, "I'm a banker." Like, oh, what kind of banker? Do you work in investment banking, commercial banking, retail? So like, there's always these sort of immediate strings to pull on it when you meet somebody. But in the context of your question, you talk about finding your professional niche. I actually want to broaden it beyond what you do for a living, because I know you're right now in the phase where your shiny new identity is, "I'm a financial planner," but there's an element of who you are as an individual. So I'll give an example from the CFP Connections conference that was at the beginning of October. So I'm out in Washington, D.C. I'm sitting with two students from CU Boulder who I've never met before. I was just asked to meet with them and talk to them and kind of give them some insight and whatnot. And I'm sitting at the table there, and Jamie Clark, who is a financial planner from Washington, sits down with us, and they're listening to the conversation and participating a little bit. And at one point, one of the students says, "Dan, do you have an opinion about," I don't even know what it was, like something to do with the profession or the nature of the CFP or something like that. And Jamie looks at them and just says, "Have you met Dan?" Because there's a brand and a professional niche that I occupy well beyond just the brand of me as a financial planner. There's Dan the financial planner, and there's Dan who writes prolifically in personal finance, who has been on the Journal of Financial Planning Advisory Board, who has served on the Next Gen National Committee, who has worked in a number of mediums and spaces, and has been very prolific and open about his thoughts, his beliefs, his views of things. And in that context, for somebody here in Longmont is just going to ask, "Hey, nice to meet you. Like, what do you do?" And I'm going to say financial planner, and they're going to have that face value response. But in the professional context, I have a very different professional niche amongst my peers in the profession. And that influences how we practice as financial planners. But that also influences the type of conversations that I have and the places we get involved. All of that to say, Emily, you have a personal brand. Again, as mentioned up top, your new professional brand is, "I'm a financial planner," but you are an individual. You have a background. Anybody listening to this has their own story to tell, has their own background. They're not just an engineer. They're not just a software developer. They're not just the owner of a business. They are more than that. And so that's the thing you want to bring to the conversation about having a professional niche and advertising yourself, because financial advisors or insurance agents or bankers are a dime a dozen. There's a million of those. There's nothing differentiating about being one of those. you have to be able to explain what's different about you as a professional, but also what's different about you as the individual. Because people don't work with financial planners. They work with Dan, they work with Greg, they work with Emily. And in that context, it doesn't matter that you're a really great financial planner or a new financial planner or a senior financial planner or kind of a dumb financial planner. At the end of the day, people do business with you and want to trust in you. We build relationships with individuals, not with their professional identities.
Hmm, that's a good point. You are very well known on LinkedIn and Twitter for your personality, I would say. But I mean, you could take several things from your life when you're trying to pick your niche. I could go the route of former business owner, or, I've been divorced, and we have several clients that have come in and they're either going through a divorce or they did recently, and I can obviously relate to that. Do you really have to pick one or the other? Because I mean, those two examples have nothing to do with each other, but you can't specialize in both, or can I?
No, there's a difference here about what you do for clients and who you work with and who you try to help and who you are. So let's again back that out a little bit. So to your question, you're sort of, do I become like a divorce specialist and I want to work with divorcees and because I can empathize with them and I've had that experience, or do I want to work with business owners because I've been a business owner, and that's fine. But let me put it to you this way, right? Because I know you better than most people who are listening to this. Not all of them, but most of them. So I could say, Emily is an avid rock climber. Emily rode her bike 70 miles over the weekend just to prove that she could, even though she's not a prolific cyclist. Emily volunteers several hours of her time for the Hour Center and other nonprofits and groups. Right? Emily is a cat owner. Emily has, built up a business and had to start over from scratch. Right? Emily came up from, I'll say in a relative sense, nothing. Right? You grew up in the relative sense, the middle of nowhere, and not from a family with a ton of money or something like that. And you've made of your life what you have. Right? Emily has volunteered overseas in third world countries to help them, for no money. Right? Just truly volunteering, but to help in medical services and to help people in need. Right? So you are many, many things. You've been many, many people to different people in different places. But in that particular sense, that all feeds into what you can do as a professional and who you can help, the story you can tell. I, for example, as a financial planner, don't really have a niche, right? We have clients who are retirees, business owners, who are young professionals, who are married, who are single, divorced. And part of that is because a lot of my fun in being a financial planner has been getting to help people in different backgrounds and in different places. But I've never really gone to the effort to say, I'm Dan Yerger, I'm the world's best financial planner for neurosurgeons or something like that. In your same sense, you don't have to do that. Right? But your story will attract different people at different times and for different reasons, and your expertise will attract different people for different times or at different times and for different reasons. So it's about bringing your whole self to your professional identity and being open to it, and not just trying to think about what is the quickest, fastest, turnkey thing I can tell somebody. Right? I'm a former business owner, or I've been divorced, and trying to get them to be interested in what you do as a professional. It's about just being that professional and naturally attracting people to who you are and what you do without necessarily being too direct about it or really trying to hone in on one particular piece of it.
Hmm. Well, this reminds me of a conversation I had with somebody a couple weeks ago at an after hours event. And he was much younger. He's a student, but he's going into financial planning. And he had all these questions. And from what I've heard, I learned a little bit about his story, but because he was so much younger, he'd had a lot less experiences and he was a lot more uncertain about, who he was and what he could share with people. What advice would you give to someone who is so much younger and hasn't had the time to do such a variety of things?
So the student has a very different experience than you as the example, and we can talk about the contrast here in a second. But for that student, if they have gone to, let's say, CU's lead school of business and they're in the PFP program and they're going to graduate with their bachelor's and the certificate to go sit the CFP exam and so on, just by the time they sit down for the CFP exam, they objectively, not subjectively, this isn't like a rah-rah statement, they objectively know more about finance than 99% of the population, even though they might be 22 years old, even though they may not have their CFP's marks yet because they haven't done the experience part yet. almost no one is educated about finance in school formally, and almost nobody, as they grow up, learns about finance in a cohesive manner that ensures not only that they have learned, but verifies their learning. We all pick up financial lessons through our lifetimes, and that means that we can be financially successful kind of by accident. But in turn to that, that does put them in a position where, even with their financial success or despite their financial success, they may still know very, very little about finance. Conversely, that 22-year-old may know a huge amount about finance and may be able to add value to somebody who is 2, 3 times their age simply because they've studied it and they actually know and understand how to apply it. So that student, doesn't have a lot of life experience. That's fine. If they still really work on mastering their craft as a financial planner, they can still add an enormous amount of value. Now, there's plenty of things you have to learn experientially, right? Buying a house is one academic exercise and a very different thing in real life. Getting divorced is sometimes an academic exercise, but very different to go through a divorce. But at the end of the day, having a formal education, at least in the area of financial planning, is a huge advantage compared to the vast majority of people in the United States.
Hmm. That is quite reassuring for probably many listeners, I'm betting. Um, I am going to pivot to the next topic, though, because I am so excited about it. That's all right. We've encountered this with several people, one in particular recently, but you have a household, however that's made up, and one person or one portion of it is a big overspender, and the other person is more of a saver or something or other. How do you approach that in conversation with them, first of all, and then we'll get to the planning piece later? But just even in that first conversation, we can often tell when we're meeting with people, one's a spender and one maybe isn't.
So this is a tough one because there's always an element of you can't force people to do something. Because there's a very easy answer here, which is the thing where you just take away their credit card and you tell them no more spending, yada, yada. But that's not what a partnership is. Often, I think what overspending actually is a failure to establish boundaries and to communicate expectations early on in a relationship. So let me lay out a hypothetical of how this can happen. You are young, somebody, and you start dating another person, and you enjoy your dates. You travel, you do fun stuff together, and you get to the point where you get married, and that's the time at which you're going to start talking about finances. Maybe you're talking about it during your engagement or shortly after your wedding, and you come to find, hey, I make more than you or you make more than me. It doesn't really matter, but part of what you might discover is, oh, you have a lot of credit card debt. And okay, that's fine. Like plenty of people have lots of credit card debt. Or you might discover, hey, we've been sort of paying 50-50 for things, but it turns out because I make $10,000-$15,000 more than you a year, I've been putting money into my 401k and then paying 50-50 for things. You haven't been able to afford to save. You've had to spend all of your money to sort of keep pace with this lifestyle we built for each other. And then what can happen over time, going one way or the other, is either incomes become disparate, right? One of them maybe stops working to be a stay-at-home parent for a while, or one of them gets a big promotion, or maybe you're just in very different fields, right? One of you is a teacher, one of you is an engineer, and the teacher is going to make okay money, but not great money. That's just the life of being a teacher. But the engineer might have the ability to 2x, 3x, 4x, 5x their income over the first decade of their career. And suddenly we have these very, very different spending behaviors just as a byproduct of how much we take home. The consequence of all of this then is that overspending is often that at some point a measurement changed along the way, right? We started to increase our income and we never changed our behaviors. So if we were spending all of our income when we were making 40,000 a year, and then we start making 70 or 80,000 a year, we just keep spending it. And the other one maybe was making 50 and now it's making 100, but they are always saving 10 or 15% of their savings, and they've kept doing that. And they come to find that what they observe is overspending in their partner is really just a failure to have clearly set expectations and to establish not what is equal, because some couples do just split things equally, but what is equitable given our income, given our expenses, the debts we bring into the relationship, the goals that we have, the hobbies and interests we have, and really trying to find a money management system in which nobody is overspending, but we also are both in a position to reasonably afford the things that we want to afford within the boundaries of our relationship.
How do you communicate that to them? Because it can be a very sensitive conversation. The person who hasn't been saving, even if they're making less, and there's very good reason, they're often very sensitive about it. They don't want to hear, well, you haven't been saving. That's often the takeaway. How do you explain that whole thing to them without either getting cut off or getting misinterpreted or just, they stop listening because they don't want to hear the rest of it, even if you had a good point at the end.
I'll give an example of a type of client we have where we often give a piece of advice here that is not necessarily related to over or underspending, but is about the household's well-being. So, the client profile here is there is a spouse who works in the school district, and there's a spouse who works somewhere in technology. So one of them is making somewhere between $50,000 and $120,000 a year in the school district, and one of them is making $150,000 to $250,000 in technology somewhere. We have like a dozen of these clients. They're wonderful people. But part of the conversation we often have with them is, hey, the one working in technology usually just has a 401k. So maximum contribution, $23,000 for those who are under 50. The one who's working for the school district has para as a pension, has a 401k, a 403b, maybe a 457, since there's some little differences between the districts and where people work specifically. But potentially they have the ability to put, $46,000 into their retirement instead of just $23,000. And in that particular case, okay, ironically, the one who makes the most money can't save as much for retirement as they otherwise would, and the one who doesn't make as much money has the ability to save way more than they can afford to save. And that sometimes turns into a conversation about subsidizing. Essentially, hey, it would be great for you as a household to be saving $69,000 between these three retirement plans. However, the lower earner is the one who has access to two-thirds of that, and the higher earner has access to only one-third of that. So here's the proposal. Let's go ahead and max fund the two retirement plans for the teacher, the school district employee, and the higher earning tech spouse. Hey, you are going to deliberately transfer the difference, right? $2,000 a month to your spouse, or $4,000 a month to your spouse, to their personal spending accounts, or wherever they sort of manage their personal spending money, as a subsidy, because it's good for you as a household. You will come out better financially as a household if you both agree to do this. But if there's no transfer of cash here, if we're not the type of household that just puts everything in the same checking savings, then we're going to find ourselves in a situation where one spouse has the same amount of money they had in the beginning, and the other spouse suddenly has their paychecks being cut, in half or more than in half by this savings behavior. So it becomes a question of a agreement about how much do we need to do as a couple, as a household, and by extension, if we're doing that, what is the lifestyle we want to be able to afford together? And then what is the sort of allowance for our personal interests and personal spending and hobbies? Kind of the money where I don't want to ask your permission and you don't want to ask my permission. We need to establish boundaries around what is okay to spend without a conversation. And that can either be a monthly amount, that can be a size of purchase, that can be an amount, quarterly or annually, but that should be a conversation that we have. So to get to the point where we answer your question, how do you bring this up to a client? We don't look at the client and say, hey, you're a good saver, you're a bad spender, you stop, you keep doing what you're doing. That's not a conversation we had here. We need to reframe our understanding of where income comes from and where it is going, and build that in a constructive sense. So in some sense, it's not to look at either partner and say, you're a good saver, you're a bad spender. It's to say, here's a new system. And by the way, as we go into this new system, it's going to require that we reallocate some of our cash flows to make sure everybody feels comfortable. Does that seem reasonable? Yes, it does. Great.
So you're taking that approach. It's not one versus the other. It's all of us versus the problem. And that's the only way we're going to frame it moving forward.
Well, and that's a really important thing to understand, because let's just get to the catastrophic version of this, right? One partner plays ball, one doesn't, and we get 3, 4, 5 years down the road, and partner A is sick of partner B not playing ball. We're going to find ourselves then in having a divorce conversation, because sometimes as financial planners, we work with divorcing clients, and we get to deal with the byproduct of this is that, when we get to court or mediation or arbitration, one spouse looks at the other spouse and says, well, he or she spent all our money and that's terrible. And it's not my fault they did that. And the court's going to say, well, tough. Like, that's why you're getting divorced, and fair enough. But that doesn't mean anything about how you're going to divide assets, about who's going to walk away with what. So in that sense, we do have to establish those ground rules and get that stuff together, because from a tax standpoint, we're all one family. From a divorce standpoint, we're all one family. From a debts and liabilities and creditor standpoint, we're all one family. So if one person is not on board with the system we're using, we have to have a conversation about the system we're using. And there are cases where there's an irreconcilable difference here, right? One person says, look, I'm going to spend every dime I make and I'm never going to save, too bad. And then the other partner has to decide, am I willing to eat that? Or is that a deal breaker? The good news is, I don't think we've ever coached somebody into getting a divorce as part of these conversations. We've always been able to get both partners to come to the table and agree to a healthy medium. But I will say that partners who aren't willing to have these conversations with each other, whether it's just them or with the help of professionals like us or a marriage counselor or whoever they need to bring into the conversation, if you don't have these conversations, one day you're going to have a different conversation. It's going to be with an attorney about how you get to divvy things up.
Hmm. Very sobering, but very true. I know we've talked about in other podcasts the importance of having those conversations earlier on rather than later to kind of prevent those deep seated habits from being very permanent before it's too late. But that bleeds a little bit into my third point and third question for you today is how to address when the client really doesn't listen to you or take your advice. Like that, example person you talked about that we haven't had to work with yet, but they're just not listening and they're not going to do it. What do you do with that?
First and foremost, there's a really important thing that every professional learns the hard way. And I'll tell it to you now. And I don't think you've learned it yet, but you're going to learn it as time goes on. So listen to the lesson, absorb it, and try to learn it as fast as you can. You cannot care about someone else more than they care about themselves. And what I mean by that is not something to do with, let's say, like sobriety or drug addiction, where you need to make an intervention and save somebody's life. I'm talking about something like personal finance, where you look at somebody and say, "Hey, you need to save enough of your income to get the 401k match. You need to not spend so much on your credit cards. You need to pay down your debt." You know that that's what's right for them. You know that that's what's important for them, and that if they don't do it, they're on a bad financial path. And all you can do is tell them that and support them in that, or try to reframe the conversation to help them see that their behavior is destructive or leading them on a bad path. What you can't do is twist their arm. What you can't do is threaten them or coerce them or place ultimatums on them, because coercion doesn't work. People have to be kind of intrinsically motivated to make their decisions, because extrinsic motivations only last as long as the extrinsic motivation is there. So if it's just you griefing this person, hey, stop spending so much money, and you just grief them constantly, they may cut back on their spending. But the day you stop griefing them about it, they're going to go right back to it, generally speaking. And there's always going to be an exception to this, so take that with a grain of salt. But when it comes to somebody who says, like, hey, what should I do about this? And you tell them what to do and then they don't do it, you have to sort of disengage from the outcome, because people ask for help and advice all the time, right? There's this joke that women complain because they want to be heard, men complain because they want solutions, and that creates a conflict in partnerships where sometimes women will complain and the man will be like, "Well, here's my suggestions," and the woman's like, "Dude, you're not listening. I don't need your suggestions. I didn't ask you for advice. I just want you to know that Cindy sucks." Right? So it's a different conversation, and that's a very stereotypical example, but I think we've all heard that example. In that same extension, when somebody asks you for advice, sometimes they're just looking for validation or confirmation. And you'll give it to them and they're happy, or you won't give it to them and they won't be happy, but they don't actually have any anticipation they're going to change their behaviors, right? There's a difference between knowledge, because knowledge is wonderful, but application is the bigger thing. As the expression goes, right? If knowledge was all we needed, we'd all be fit millionaires. But the state of the world is that is not the case. So all of that to come back to the core question here, if somebody's asking you for advice but they're not taking it, fine, that's their issue. If you care about the outcome more than them, you can still try to nudge them, support them, encourage them, be a good role model, but you can't force people to take your advice.
Hmm. Well, how does it apply in, people are paying for advice, they're paying for our services. So obviously in the beginning, we're going to say, you should be doing this, you should do that. These are recommendations. Kind of encourage them, and accountability is important. Sometimes that's all people need, is to have that meeting with us. And after a couple, they're like, yep, I understand, and I'm going to implement the plan. But at a certain point, if they don't do that, do you ever kind of fire them as a client almost because you're no longer providing value? Or is that accountability piece enough to keep them on? And I know it's situational, but how do you kind of find that cutoff point?
I think you have to decide whether your advice or your presence in their life is more helpful than harmful, or more harmful than helpful. So, for example, we have a client who has been an on and off client for the better part of a decade at this point, that we regularly advise around paying down debt, building up a savings, trying to build up an emergency fund, etc. And there's a basic premise here where you could just observe, okay, well, they're paying you a couple $100 a month to tell them the same thing over and over and over again and trying to get them to do that. But the trick is they've been worse off every time they've been what I'll call unsupported. Where in the times they haven't been clients, they've added on more debt, they failed to save, they've made career moves or changes or financial decisions that have harmed them pretty directly, and the byproduct of that is, hey, like that's not good. That is a very bad thing for you. So even though you should theoretically be better off spending that couple $100 a month just paying off your debt or putting it in your savings than having us kind of harass you to do it, every time you've been unsupported, you end out worse. So on some level, we're making better progress, even though maybe we're making slower progress than we could in a purely mathematical sense by having somebody to be their accountability partner.
Whereas someone else that doesn't show those kind of patterns, maybe you would just say, hey, it's better if you quit working with us for some time and pay it on your credit card debt. And that's the advice.
And sometimes that's the advice at the outset. You've been in the room when I've told somebody, hey, look, I know you want to hire us, but my advice is going to be pay off your credit cards for the next 6 months. There's nothing else you should do. There's no higher priority. So do that and then come back in 6 months. And that way you can put that extra X hundred or extra $1,000 towards your debt and get there that much faster. And sometimes people don't want to hear that. They look at you and go like, well, like, yeah, pay off my debt. I know that that's important, but I want to do other stuff. And it's like, look, as a financial planner, my responsibility is to help you have a good financial outcome from what you do. And I'm telling you, there's nothing else that I would recommend than just that. That is your number one priority. But by extension from that, I think the biggest thing that's going to see me say, okay, we're done. We need to release you from this relationship is going to be somebody who literally just doesn't engage with it. It's one thing to ask for advice, get advice, and decide you're not going to follow it. That's different than somebody who does not engage in the process required to provide them with adequate advice, or in turn, who does deliberately destructive things despite the advice. Right. So it's one thing if I look at a client and say, hey, you should max out your 401k. And they say, I hear you, man, but like, I just feel really, really stressed by having a auto loan on a HELOC right now. I'm going to pay off those first. Okay. It's not as financially optimal, but if you're going to feel less stressed by doing that, that's fine. It's still financially productive. It's different if that person says, I'm not going to max the 401k. I'm also not going to pay off the debt. In fact, I'm going to go buy a new truck. Okay, well, you didn't need a new truck. Your financial plan at no point said that you wanted or needed a new truck. Your current truck is 2 years old. So what are we doing? At that point, that becomes a pretty big red flag that this person is not actually asking you for advice or asking for your help. They're just asking for you to give them permission to do what they're going to do anyway. And there comes a time where you sort of have to divorce yourself from that and say, look, respectfully, I'm not giving you permission to do things as your financial planner, and you're still doing things that are destructive. You tell me you want one thing, but you're doing a different thing, and we're doing this over and over and over again. And at a certain point, you're not engaging me for my professional advice. You're just using me as a scapegoat for your financial problems. And at that point, we don't need to work with you. You can deal with those on your own.
Right. Well, that reminds me, I have another question now. I'm going down a little trail here. But what about when people don't tell you things? Most of our clients email us regularly if they bought the truck or they had a child or they did whatever. What about when they don't keep you informed and therefore are pretty far off the plan just because we have outdated information and they haven't remembered to let us know?
I think it's a really big difference in the conduct here. So, good example, some of my favorite clients, came in for their consult recently, and they had way more income this year than was expected because they had to take more money out of retirement plans than was expected. And that was a big surprise to me because we'd had, 3 meetings earlier this year, never came up, was never an issue. But we sat down here in Q4 and it's like, oh, you've got literally like $150,000 more income than you should have. What happened here? And that just really came down to a bunch of one-off sequence of events, things where, hey, we needed to buy this, we needed to buy that, this thing happened, that thing happened. So it wasn't deliberate malfeasance or avoidance. They weren't trying to hide something. They just were dealing with their problems in the moment, took the money they needed, made the purchases and payments that they needed to, and it all added up. And at the end of the year, suddenly here's a big surprise. There's no malicious intent there. It's very different when somebody is essentially lying to you. And what I would describe this as is, in a therapeutic sense, you're dealing with an addict, and you're dealing with an addict who is coming to you as a therapist for help with their addiction problems, and they are lying to you. It's one thing to go into that relationship knowing that is probably going to happen at some point because addicts are addicts, and they're going to sort of go through the motions of being addicts and the problems that that causes. It's a very different thing when somebody engages you as a professional, does not display any of those things, is not clear about those things, but every time you have a conversation, like, oh yeah, we bought a car. Oh yeah, we sold that car. Oh yeah, we bought a cabin. We sold a rental property. I know you said we couldn't afford to do this year, but we did it anyway. Because at that point, now we're in conflict. And I'm not here as your financial planner to be in conflict with you. Sometimes I have to be in conflict to give you accountability or to tell you a tough truth, but it's not my job to police your behavior. Right? It's not my job to say no, you can't do that, and if you don't do it correctly, I'm gonna resign as your financial planner, or I'm gonna scold you. We're all adults here, but there is a keen, distinct difference between a person who just fails to communicate, because we all occasionally forget to communicate about various things here or there, and somebody who is deliberately seeking your advice and then avoiding your advice and then not giving you full information. Because as financial planners, if we give you bad enough advice, we become liable for that. So if somebody is going to overtly or deliberately lie to me or misrepresent things to me, that's an immediate firing offense. So to be clear for any clients listening to this, if there's a thing you're worried about, should I tell Dan about that? Just tell me. It's fine, right? Because particularly if it's just a thing you sort of forgot about and that sort of thing. But if we've had a clear conversation about how you're going to do a particular thing and you say, yes, I'm going to do that, and then you don't do that, you do something else and it's financially destructive, and then I'm just going to find out later somehow, that is a big problem.
Sure. Well, I think they get intimidated. I hate to, defend keeping information from you, but people have said before they come in the conference room and there's multiple of us in there and they get nervous and I think they just don't want to say anything sometimes. And I think maybe Dan will find out when I show him my tax returns at the end of the year.
Well, and to that point, I'm sympathetic, because our job as financial planners is to be transparent, to build rapport, to build trust. And that's really what the core of this comes down to: is, do these people trust us to give them advice and assistance in a way where they don't feel judged or feel bad about it? And that's absolutely valuable and valid, and that's something where we are responsible for that, because if we can't build trust with our clients, that is problematic. But on the other side of that, if we're finding ourselves having a conversation with somebody and they're just not saying something, and they're just going to sort of dread the day we find out, that's a problem all around, because it means they're not engaging us in that trust building exercise. We're not engaging them well enough in trust building to build that rapport and have that relationship. But at the end of the day, we can't help clients if we don't have the best information to help them with.
It always circles back to the good relationship piece. Very good. I have a final follow-up question now. Instead of you asking me what I've learned, I'm going to ask you a question, in that, the end of the year is coming, holiday season, people are busy, we're having a harder time getting a hold of people. But what is something you think that people either forget about or wait too long and don't have the time to do before end of year that they really should?
On some level, it's not a specific thing. It's taking a moment to observe your own behavior in this time of year and to be a little bit more honest about it. And what I mean by that is, throughout the year, if you ask somebody how they are, they'll usually either just say like good or fine, or the other version that's not a qualitative statement but is a statement about what they're doing is they'll say, I'm busy. I'm really busy. I've been really busy. I don't know an unbusy person. Every person I know is busy, right? My retired parents are busy, right? Like, my independently wealthy clients are busy. Everybody is busy. And so we get into the holiday season, particularly kind of as we hit Thanksgiving and get to the end of the year, and suddenly people become sort of psychologically busy. But I want you to think about what the holidays are for most people. It's maybe a day where you're going to cook food for Thanksgiving, right? Or prep for that. It's a day or two where you're going to decorate your house. It's, let's say, 2 to 4 ugly sweater parties you're going to attend. It's some present shopping, and then it's a big Christmas, Hanukkah, whatever holidays you might hold in your family celebration. Cool. That's like maybe, let's say, 20 to 30 hours of extra stuff. Okay. There's a lot more time in a month than that 20 to 30 hours. And if you tell me I'm so busy I can't get anything done, but you find yourself watching a whole season of something on Netflix in the month of December, you are making a conscious decision to delay appropriate and important financial decisions or life decisions or activities. And unfortunately, financial mechanisms and things like that do not wait around on you, right? The calendar year will roll around. The Roth conversion deadline is the Roth conversion deadline. Your deadline to set up that retirement plan for your business, is essentially here, right? Every platform I'm talking to essentially says this Friday is the last day to get something in place for January 1st, right? Your open enrollment window is only a week or two. If you don't sign up for it, you end up with what you end up with. So all of this to say, what I've learned over the years and what I caution people to be careful about is we often look at the holidays as just this crazy time and nobody has any time, yada, yada, yada. But you are often sort of using that as an excuse to engage in avoidance of important things. So I'm not saying you have to spend the entire month of December being hyper financially vigilant or responding to every email in 5 minutes or something like that, but just be very mindful that the holidays are a wonderful time. Family is a wonderful thing. Getting to enjoy these special, once a year sort of things is very, very important. But don't fall off the wagon of financial responsibility, of just general responsibility, because it's the holidays. It's a wonderful time, but it shouldn't be a destructive time.
That's a very good point. That's a good way to end it.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.